How America Was Stolen, Episode 20. When the war finally ended, the land was quiet. Not peaceful. Empty. Episode 20 begins in the aftermath of destruction, when the colonies looked across burned villages, abandoned fields, and mass graves, and drew the most dangerous conclusion of all. This works. King Philip's War didn't just devastate native nations. It convinced the colonies that native resistance could be crushed completely. That realization changed the future of the continent forever. Settlers walked onto lands that had once been alive with songs, trade routes, ceremonies, and generations of memory. Now those places were silent, and the silence was interpreted as victory, not tragedy. Colonial leaders documented the war not as a warning, but as a success story. They wrote that native nations had been broken, removed, or vanquished. They never wrote about the children sold into slavery. They never wrote about villages burned in winter. They never wrote about elders executed for refusing to abandon their land. Because those truths didn't fit the narrative they needed. The colonies took the lesson and applied it immediately. After the war, land seizures accelerated. Territories once considered dangerous were suddenly opened for settlement. New towns appeared almost overnight. Farms spread across former native fields. Roads cut through sacred ground. Expansion no longer paused for negotiation. Why negotiate, when force had proven faster? Native survivors faced impossible choices. Some were forced into small, controlled areas under colonial supervision. Early versions of what would later become reservations. Others fled west, carrying trauma and memory into lands not yet claimed. Some were absorbed into other tribes, trying to preserve identity while avoiding extinction. And many simply disappeared from the records altogether. Not because they vanished, but because the colonies stopped counting them. Erasure became bureaucratic. European powers watched closely. England, France, and Spain all took notes. Colonial violence was no longer embarrassing. It was instructive. The war had proven that settler societies could eliminate native resistance and replace entire populations. This realization fueled empire building. More ships were sent. More settlers encouraged. More soldiers deployed. The continent was no longer a mystery. It was a target. What made this stage especially dangerous was confidence. The settlers no longer feared native alliances the way they once had. They believed resistance could always be crushed eventually. Time, numbers, and violence were on their side. And that belief removed restraint. Colonial writings from this period openly discussed the inevitability of native disappearance. Native nations were spoken of in the past tense, even when they were still fighting. Once a people are imagined as already gone, anything done to them feels justified. But the story the colonies told themselves was incomplete, because while some native nations had been shattered, others were watching carefully. They learned from the war. They studied settler tactics. They adapted. They saw that treaties failed. They saw that submission led to slow death. They saw that resistance carried terrible cost, but sometimes bought time, and time mattered. This episode shows us a critical truth. America did not expand because native people gave up. It expanded because colonizers learned how to destroy faster than native nations could recover. But even now, even after genocide, slavery, and erasure, native resistance did not end. It transformed, it moved, it waited, it survived. The colonies believed they had solved the native problem. They were wrong. Because as expansion moved westward, it would meet new nations, new alliances, and new leaders who refused to disappear.